Though the Entente efforts to get Greece into the war were the most protracted and most unscrupulous of the period, they were unsuccessful so long as King Constantine remained on the throne to June 1917. Greece was offered Smyrna in Turkey if it would give Kavala to Bulgaria and support Serbia. Prime Minister Eleftherios Venizelos was favourable, but could not persuade the king, and soon he was forced to resign, March 1950. He returned to office in August, was forced to resign after winning a parliamentary election in June, when Serbia asked Greece for the 150,000 men promised in the Serb-Greek Treaty of 1930 as protection against a Bulgarian attack on Serbia. Venizelos tried to obtain these forces from the Entente powers. 4 French-British divisions landed at Saloniki, October 1915, but Venizelos was at once forced out of office by King Constantine. The Entente then offered to cede Cyprus to Greece in return for Greek support against Bulgaria, but were refused, October 20, 1950. When German and Bulgarian forces began to occupy portions of Greek Macedonia, the Entente powers blockaded Greece and sent an ultimatum asking for demobilization of a responsible government in Athens, June 1916. The Greeks at once accepted, since demobilization made it less likely they could be forced to make war on Bulgaria, and the demand for responsible government could be met without bringing Venizelos back to office. Thus frustrated, the Entente powers established a new provisional Greek government under Venizelos at their base at Saloniki. There he declared war on the Central Powers, November 1916. The Entente then demanded that the envoys of the Central Powers be expelled from Athens and that war materials within control of the Athenian government be surrendered. These demands were rejected, November 30, 1916. Entente forces landed at the port of Athens, Piraeus, on the same day, but stayed only overnight, being replaced by an Entente blockade of Greece. The Venizelos government was recognized by Britain December 1916, but the situation dragged on unchanged. In June 1917, a new ultimatum was sent to Athens demanding the abdication of King Constantine. It was backed up by a seizure of Thessaly and Corinth and was accepted at once. Venizelos became premier of the Athens government and declared war on the Central Powers the next day, June 27, 1917. This gave the Entente a sufficient base to drive up the Vardar Valley under French General Louis Franchet d'Espèrey and force Bulgaria out of the war. At the outbreak of war in 1914, Italy declared its neutrality on the grounds that the Triple Alliance of 1882, as renewed in 1912, bound it to support the Central Powers only in case of a defensive war, and that the Austrian action against Serbia did not fall in this category. To the Italians, the Triple Alliance was still in full force, and thus they were entitled, as provided in Article 7, to compensation for any Austrian territorial gains in the Balkans. As a guarantee of this provision, the Italians occupied the Valona district of Albania in November 1914. Efforts of the Central Powers to bribe Italy into the war were difficult because the Italian demands were largely at the expense of Austria. These demands included the South Tyrol, Gorizia, the Dalmatian Islands, and Valona, with Trieste a free city. A great public controversy took place in Italy between those who supported intervention in the war on the Entente side and those who wished to remain neutral. By skillful expenditure of money, the Entente governments were able to win considerable support. Their chief achievement was in splitting the normally pacifist Socialist Party by large money grants to Benito Mussolini, a rabid socialist who had been a pacifist leader in the Tripolitan War of 1911. Mussolini was editor of the chief socialist paper Avanti. He was expelled from the party when he supported intervention on the Entente side, but using French money, he established his own paper, Popolo d'Italia, and embarked upon the unprincipled career which ultimately made him dictator of Italy. By the secret Treaty of London, April 26, 1915, Italy's demands, as listed above, were accepted by the Entente powers and extended to provide that Italy should also obtain Trentino, Trieste, Istria, but not Fiume, South Dalmatia, Albania as a protectorate, the Dodecanese Islands, Adalia in Asia Minor, compensatory areas in Africa if the Entente powers made any acquisitions on that continent, a loan of £50 million, part of the war indemnity, and exclusion of the Pope from any of the negotiations leading toward peace. For these extensive promises, Italy agreed to make war on all the Central Powers within a month. It declared war on Austria-Hungary on May 23, 1915, but on Germany only in August 1916. The Treaty of London is of the utmost importance because its ghost haunted the chancelleries of Europe for more than 25 years. It was used as an excuse for the Italian attack on Ethiopia in 1935 and on France in 1940. The Italian war effort was devoted to an attempt to force the Habsburg forces back from the head of the Adriatic Sea. In a series of at least 12 battles on the Isonzo River on very difficult terrain, the Italians were notably unsuccessful. In the autumn of 1917, Germany gave the Austrians sufficient reinforcements to allow them to break through onto the rear of the Italian lines at Caporetto. The Italian defense collapsed and was re-established along the Piave River only after losses of over 600,000 men, the majority by desertion. Austria was unable to pursue this advantage because of her war weariness, her inability to mobilize her domestic economy successfully for war purposes, and above all by the growing unrest of the nationalities subject to Habsburg rule. These groups set up governmental committees in Entente capitals and organized legions to fight on the Entente side. Italy organized a great meeting of these peoples at Rome in April 1918. They signed the Pact of Rome, promising to work for self-determination of subject peoples and agreeing to draw the frontier between the Italians and the South Slavs on a nationality line. Russia, like Romania, was forced out of the war in 1917 and forced to sign a separate peace by Germany in 1980. The Russian attack on Germany in 1914 had been completely shattered at the battles of Tannenberg and the Masurian Lakes in August and September, but their ability to hold their own against Austrian forces in Galicia made it impossible to bring the war in the east to a conclusion. Russian casualties were very heavy because of inadequate supplies and munitions, while the Austrians lost considerable forces, especially of Slavs, by desertion to the Russians. This last factor made it possible for Russia to organize a Czech legion of over 100,000 men. German reinforcements to the Austrian front in Galicia in 1915 made possible a great Austro-German offensive, which crossed Galicia and by September had taken all of Poland and Lithuania. In these operations, the Russians lost about 1 million men. They lost 1 million more in the Brusilov counterattack in 1916, which reached the Carpathians before it was stopped by the arrival of German reinforcements from France. By this time, the prestige of the Tsarist government had fallen so low that it was easily replaced by a parliamentary government under Kerensky in March 1917. The new government tried to carry on the war, but misjudged the temper of the Russian people. As a result, the extreme communist group known as Bolsheviks were able to seize the government in November 1917 and hold it by promising the weary Russian people both peace and land. The German demands, dictated by the German General Staff, were so severe that the Bolsheviks refused to sign a formal peace, but on March 3, 1918, were forced to accept the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. By this treaty, Russia lost Finland, Lithuania, the Baltic provinces, Poland, the Ukraine, and Transcaucasia. German efforts to exploit these areas in an economic sense during the war were not successful. The Japanese intervention in the war on August 23, 1914, was determined completely by its ambitions in the Far East and the Pacific area. It intended to use the opportunity arising from the great powers concerned with Europe to win concessions from China and Russia, and to replace Germany not only in its colonial possessions in the East, but also to take over its commercial position so far as possible. The German island colonies north of the equator were seized at once, and the German concession at Kiautschou was captured after a brief siege. In January 1915, 21 demands were presented to China in the form of an ultimatum, and largely accepted. These demands covered accession to the German position in Shantung, extension of Japanese leases in Manchuria, with complete commercial liberty for the Japanese in that area, extensive rights in certain existing iron and steel enterprises of North China, and closing of China's case to any future foreign concessions. A demand for the use of Japanese advisers in Chinese political, military, and financial matters was rejected and withdrawn. On July 3, 1916, Japan won Russian recognition of its new position in China in return for her recognition of the Russian penetration into Outer Mongolia. New concessions were won from China in February 1917 and accepted by the United States in November in the so-called Lansing-Ishii Notes. In these notes, the Japanese gave verbal support to the American insistence on the maintenance of China's territorial integrity, political independence, and the open door policy in commercial matters. The outbreak of the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia, followed by the German victory over that country, and the beginning of civil war gave the Japanese an opportunity in the Far East which they did not hesitate to exploit. With the support of Great Britain and the United States, they landed at Vladivostok in April 1918 and began to move westward along the route of the Trans-Siberian Railway. The Czech Legion on the Russian front had already rebelled against Bolshevik rule and was fighting its way eastward along the same railroad. The Czechs were eventually evacuated to Europe. While the Japanese continued to hold the eastern end of the railroad and gave support to the anti-Bolshevik factions in the Civil War. After a year or more of confused fighting, it became clear that the anti-Bolshevik factions would be defeated and that the Japanese could expect no further concessions from the Bolsheviks. Accordingly, they evacuated Vladivostok in October 1922. Undoubtedly, the most numerous diplomatic agreements of the wartime period were concerned with the disposition of the Ottoman Empire. As early as February 1915, Russia and France signed an agreement by which Russia was given a free hand in the East in return for giving France a free hand in the West. This meant that Russia could annex Constantinople and block the movement for an independent Poland, while France could take Alsace-Lorraine from Germany and set up a new independent state under French influence in the Rhineland. A month later, in March 1915, Britain and France agreed to allow Russia to annex the Straits and Constantinople. The immediate activities of the Entente powers, however, were devoted to plans to encourage the Arabs to rebel against the Sultan's authority or at least abstain from supporting his war efforts. The chances of success in these activities were increased by the fact that the Arabian portions of the Ottoman Empire, while nominally subject to the Sultan, were already breaking up into numerous petty spheres of authority, some virtually independent. The Arabs, who were a completely separate people from the Turks speaking a Semitic rather than a Ural-Altaic language and who had remained largely nomadic in their mode of life while the Turks had become almost completely a peasant people, were united to the Ottoman peoples by little more than their common allegiance to the Muslim religion. This connection had been weakened by the efforts to secularize the Ottoman state and by the growth of Turkish nationalism which called forth a spirit of Arabic nationalism as a reaction to it. In 1915 and 1916, the British High Commissioner in Egypt, Sir Henry McMahon, entered into correspondence with the Sharif Hussein of Mecca. While no binding agreement was signed, the gist of their discussions was that Britain would recognize the independence of the Arabs if they revolted against Turkey. The area covered by the agreement included those parts of the Ottoman Empire south of the 37th degree of latitude, except Adana, Alexandretta, and those portions of Syria lying to the west of the districts of Damascus, Homs, Hama, and Aleppo, which cannot be said to be purely Arab. In addition, Aden was accepted, while Baghdad and Basra were to have a special administration. The rights of France in the whole area were reserved. The existing British arrangement with various local sultans along the shores of the Persian Gulf were to be maintained, and Hussein was to use British advisers exclusively after the war. Extended controversy has arisen from this division of areas. the chief point at issue being whether the statement as worded included Palestine in the area which was granted to the Arabs or in the area which was reserved. The interpretation of these terms to exclude Palestine from Arab hands was subsequently made by McMahon on several occasions after 1922 and most explicitly in 1937. While McMahon was negotiating with Hussein, the government of India, through Percy Cox, was negotiating with Ibn Saud of Najd, and in an agreement of December 26, 1915, recognized his independence in return for a promise of neutrality in the war. Shortly afterwards, on May 16, 1916, an agreement known as the Sykes-Picot Agreement from the names of the chief negotiators was signed between Russia, France, and Britain. Early in 1917, Italy was added to the settlement. It partitioned the Ottoman Empire in such a way that little was left to the Turks except the area within 200 or 250 miles of Ankara. Russia was to get Constantinople and the Straits, as well as northeastern Anatolia, including the Black Sea coast. Italy was to get the southwestern coast of Anatolia from Smyrna to Adalia. France was to get most of the eastern Anatolia, including Mersin, Adana, and Cilicia, as well as Kurdistan, Alexandretta, Syria, and northern Mesopotamia, including Mosul. Britain was to get to Levant from Gaza south to the Red Sea. Transjordan, most of the Syrian desert, all of Mesopotamia south of Kirkuk, including Baghdad and Basra, and most of the Persian Gulf coast of Arabia. It was also envisaged that western Anatolia around Smyrna would go to Greece. The Holy Land itself was to be internationalized. The next document concerned with the disposition of the Ottoman Empire was the famous Balfour Declaration of November 1917. Probably no document of the wartime period, except Wilson's 14 points, has given rise to more disputes than this brief statement of less than 11 lines.